So yeah, we worked on raising funds for a mini grant program to help organizations that may or may not have been in kind of the civic space. I think the census provided a lot of opportunity for organizations that were, wanting to stay nonpartisan, but the census affects everyone. And so we were able to kind of bring in new partners to either the democracy or civic space that may have not been involved, or we're able to give money out to organizations that had done many campaign cycles and had done a lot of voter engagement.
You're listening to Relish This, the Purpose Marketing Podcast. Here's your host, Stu Swineford.
Hey everybody, Stu here with a really great episode of Relish This. My guest today is Gillian Winbourn, and she is the executive director of Together We Count. And Together We Count is this really interesting nonprofit that spins up activities once every 10 years as we approach the census, and they help create coalitions of people who are helping to make sure that as many people as possible are being counted for our census taking. We talked a lot about kind of the inspire phase of engagement, given that they have to try to figure out how to keep people engaged during this kind of lull, and also have a real challenge with getting messages out and getting the word out about the census and how important it is. It was a really fun conversation where, she went into a ton of detail in terms of all the great work that they're doing over there. And I hope you enjoy it. I had a great time talking with Gillian. Here we go. Gillian, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for being on the show. It's exciting to talk with you. I think we first met over LinkedIn, and I talked with, I think, your former executive director over there at Together We Count, and you're the new executive director. Is that right?
Yes. It's I am the new executive director. Really, it was just because the 2020 census lasted longer than we anticipated. So we were trying to brainstorm ideas on how to extend the program and extend the project and the organization. And really at the time that we were talking about extending and thinking about money ways, COVID was in full swing. So we really didn't want to divert any money or resources away from a lot of the philanthropic efforts that were going into that emergency, which is ongoing. So this was kind of one of the easiest ways for us is just to move our executive director to a senior advisor role, and then I kind of take over operations. But she was still very much a part of the organization in a pretty hands-on way, but I just kind of took over the back end aspect.
That's awesome. So doing a census is challenging in any year, much less one as hectic as last year was for all of us. Tell us a little bit more about your organization and what you guys are doing and how things went.
Yeah, it's really funny that 2020 was so difficult because we assumed that the 2020 census would be very difficult from many years out. So really in 2016 and early 2017, Rosemary Rodriguez, who has worked in city council, she's worked for a past Denver mayor, she's worked for past state senator, she's worked for senators as a state director. So she really has been plugged into Colorado for many years, and she's volunteered with the census since 1990.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so she has a lot of kind of personal experience with it. And early on, particularly with the rhetoric from the Trump administration and just our general lack of trust in government, apathy about giving away information, and really no one door knocking anymore. She saw this problem coming from miles away and knew that there had to be more of an effort than ever before. And so, we couldn't have anticipated COVID-19 at all, but we did anticipate a lot of challenges. And so we were able to at least build a pretty good infrastructure to support the organizations that were doing work. And, that was just so critical to COVID-19 when everyone was in an emergency situation. There was no time or energy or capacity for people to take on the census as well as their other priorities if they didn't already have it built into their organizations, or if they didn't already have it, financially, if they weren't also financially tied to doing census outreach. So we were truly the hub organization on the nonprofit side. The census is a federal exercise, but has many partners statewide, regional, national. And so we were really the kind of nonprofit hub organization for the state of Colorado.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So your organization gives grants and then helps other nonprofit organizations in the census years. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so we had never existed in previous census cycles. And as I kind of alluded to, the Census Bureau, really their model for outreach really is reliant upon organizations kind of volunteering their time and energy and effort, which I think, in the past has been varying degrees of successful. But as we as a state and communities rely more and more on direct service providers and nonprofits, we knew that they would not have any capacity without any financial incentive to work on the census. And, we spent many, many moons and, many years talking with nonprofit organizations, and they all really said the same thing, like, we need money. So yeah, we worked on raising funds for a mini grant program to help organizations that may or may not have been in kind of the civic space. I think the census provided a lot of opportunity for organizations that were, wanting to stay nonpartisan, but the census affects everyone. And so we were able to kind of bring in new partners to either the democracy or civic space that may have not been involved, or we're able to give money out to organizations that had done many campaign cycles and had done a lot of voter engagement and stuff like that. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, it was a really pretty diverse coalition. And it also, a lot of our work bled into other work that was being done nationwide. And it also helped us create a community so that when something like the grant program for census outreach from the state of Colorado was around, there were enough people that knew what needed to be done, what level of engagement this would take. We were not a lobbying organization, but there were partners around that were able to be informed and say, this is going to take some serious money, and we think the state should be able to contribute to that significantly, which they were able to with the $6 million grant fund. So really just, building coalitions. And the other funny thing about the census is that, it is a federal exercise. And as many of us know, anything to deal with the feds is, much more complicated than you would imagine. And so one of the main things we really took on was training, because I always say the census is very deceptively complicated, because you're dealing with people and you're dealing with their houses, and you're dealing with people answering what they may feel as personal information and personal identifiable information. So it got really complicated really quickly, and we wanted to make sure that we were a conduit of information because we know trusted community leaders and trusted nonprofits. They do not want to. They want to make sure that they stay trusted, and they don't want to lie, and they don't want to give false information to the people in their community.
Right. So it sounds like it was, a multi-pronged kind of effort where there was an information distribution component where you're trying to just get out to the citizens and people who are being counted, what to expect and allay some of those fears that may have existed, as well as try and mobilize a volunteer force.
Exactly. And, it's really challenging, the census cycle, because it's every 10 years. And so there's just very few, even people at nonprofits that remember the last census. Or if they do remember the last census, they don't really remember the details of what was done or what worked best. And 10 years ago is a long time ago. We have, especially the 2010 to 2020 jump, we have, extreme advances in social media and technology. And so it's really hard to plan for it. And it's really hard to, I think there are a lot of lessons to be taken from previous census cycles, but it does feel like you're almost reinventing the wheel each time. And so it really takes a lot of training, and it just takes a lot of support, more so than one might imagine.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a challenge. I can only imagine you get, you basically get tossed in the deep end every 10 years and, figure it out. And then by the time the next census comes around, a lot of those people who have that knowledge are, have gone on to other things probably. And so you have to just retrain people constantly.
Yeah. And, it's people change jobs. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And yeah, circumstances change. I mean, I don't blame anyone, or it's just kind of inherent in the 10-year cycle, but it does make it more challenging. And especially when a lot of the work is assumed to be on a volunteer basis. You just have people who do even have experience just may or may not have the capacity to really take up the charge.
Right.
And so that is a lot of loss of time and energy, and, you can't always replicate that again.
Right. How did it go in state? What were your results? Do you feel like, based upon the, coming into it with some trepidation, how did things actually turn out?
The interesting thing is now it's very interesting that we know more now than we have in previous census cycles. The Census Bureau has been better about kind of releasing information, and particularly with the digital census, they were able to give us kind of in-time measurements of where certain areas were doing better than others. So we really, I'll start geographically, and then I'll kind of dive a little bit into the numbers, and then the timeline is still very, very messed up for the census and the impact. So geographically, the other aspect is our most reliable data in preparation for 2020 was 2010 census data.
Okay.
And so that's really difficult in a place like Colorado, where we've had pretty expansive growth, and especially in the Denver metro area, but also in the Western Slope. So we were already kind of, and that's, we were already kind of working from a deficit in that sense, that we knew these communities had changed a lot. And so that's why it took so much engagement and talking to everyone we possibly could to make sure that we knew how the communities had changed, so we could use, the qualitative and the quantitative aspects when we were looking at our maps and our numbers. In terms of, really how COVID impacted the census, it was pretty brutal nationwide, but I would say that it really hit us at a bad time in the mountain areas. And that was particularly because the ski area is closed.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have statewide lockdown happening March 15th, the census online portal opened March 12th. So we
Okay.
were at least able to be online. But particularly in these kind of what the Census Bureau calls group quarters, a lot of in-person canvassing, that was supposed to commence on March 20th, around March 20th. So that was all suspended. So
Right.
basically, if you lived in a rural area of Colorado that doesn't receive mail consistently, or you have a P.O. box, you probably didn't know that the census was happening maybe until June.
Okay.
So we lost a lot of months in critical areas that really just we couldn't really do anything about. So we, and there were definitely pockets of the Front Range area where, where we lagged behind. But the good thing is that we were kind of able to see that sort of early. And so we were able to kind of at least do our best to course correct and try and help specific communities do targeted ads, targeted social media, stuff like that. So because of the COVID delays, the whole operation was delayed. We had, the online portal was up until October 15th, but we did have the delays in the door knocking operation, which is really critical. So due to those delays, we won't get the official census numbers until late 2021. And this will impact redistricting and a whole host of other aspects that the Census Bureau hasn't exactly told us yet.
Right.
But really the delays were just critical. The initial numbers are that in Colorado, we potentially likely missed around 64,000 people, which is not insignificant. It's a large number. I think the questions that we will always be looking for is, who do we think those populations were? Where were they located? And we can have a little bit of a sense of where they might be located just based on the data that the Census Bureau released, but that's sort of where we're at right now. So we did, and in any census you do miss some people. There are people that are overcounted and there are people that are undercounted. But the two critical elements are the rural populations, which is a significant part of our state, were really delayed in receiving any census information. And the second population is the college kids. So typically college kids are counted where they're living on April 1st. And that can be, their residential dorm, or it could be, if they're living in a college town on off-campus housing. Mm-hmm. So when you had those kids sent home before April 1st, there's a lot of confusion on where they should be counted. And so, it was very confusing on the Census Bureau end, on our end. And it was really challenging to communicate that to our grantees and to our nonprofit partners and to our coalition, because things were changing daily, and we really just didn't have a good sense of the timeline and the operation. So it was very chaotic, and it's still, I would say, it's still pretty chaotic in terms of them combing through the data and making sure that it's accurate.
So are you still active right now, or has the nonprofit kind of spun down for the time being until we approach the next census? Do you run full time, throughout that 10-year cycle?
Yeah. So we are winding down. Ideally, I think all census work should work in between the 10-year cycle, but the reality of, nonprofit work is that, it's not necessarily realistic to continue to do census work for the next, 4 or 5 years without anything concrete. Ideally, we will take kind of this information and utilize it for other, statewide issues such as, vaccine hesitancy, any, other civic engagement. I think, we were a temporary organization that we always kind of said that we were going to be a temporary organization, which I'm not sure if we should have said out loud too much, but we were really lucky to be fiscally sponsored by Rose Community Foundation, and they gave us a lot of space and time to build this, and they were just so supportive. But it was an interesting organization because we had never had an organization like this before, particularly for the census. And it was really a long-term campaign and kind of a point in time. So I think those are really valuable organizations, but they are challenging in where they house, how do they look, how do they pivot. And I think, part of the reason is Rosemary is kind of semi-retiring, which she has done before, but and I will continue to work in this space, but it just didn't really make sense. But we're hoping, and we have been able to talk to some kind of statewide partners on making sure that this information kind of lives on.
Right.
But yeah, ideally we would be able to what they call evergreen, or at least that's what the census people say. Mm-hmm. But we just couldn't really figure out a way to make that happen.
Gotcha.
Cycle.
Gotcha. So does the bulk of your revenue come from grants and partnerships, or where are you funded?
Yes. So we're almost fully funded by Colorado philanthropic organizations. We did receive a pretty sizable grant from a national advocacy organization that was kind of a group of national funders that kind of pooled their money together to give out grants to people working on the state level, but we were mostly funded by Colorado foundations.
Interesting. And does that typically happen during the 5-year kind of on cycle that I heard you talk about a little bit, or do you start fundraising right away for 2030's census, for example?
I think there's a couple of different ways that we think that, there's what we did and what we think will be better in the future. A number of cities did create positions for census outreach coordinators, and we think that more cities and counties should do that. We think that they should write it into their budgets starting in probably 2027, and ideally tie it a little bit more to economic development. I think that is one component that we didn't quite make the connection early enough. Because the census is really economic development. It's paying for schools and jobs and roads and, opportunity zones and, community developed block grants are all based on census. So ideally, that is one way. We do think that the state should continue to make this a legislative priority. They were able to allocate $6 million, which was not insignificant. But, we had a report done by the Colorado Fiscal Institute that called for $12 million for, robust outreach. So we know that it will continue to take that much. And really this is dependent upon the federal level, making census work still pretty voluntary on the state and community level. So we don't anticipate that the Census Bureau will be able to have more resources for state and local, either nonprofits or governmental organizations. So while we're really happy that the philanthropic organizations, took really a gamble, they had never really had to invest in census work before. So while we're really happy, we also think that there should be continued funding streams from, state and local agencies, because it affects so much of our state, our bottom line.
Right.
And it's what we have for 10 years. So I think we were really lucky, and we were able to tap into great networks, and really had great support behind us. But ideally, we would like the support to be a little bit more institutionalized in the government. And it won't happen at the federal level. Just, I can see that on the horizon, but at the state and local level.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the idea of this economic play. Typically, one of the things that I've found, I'm on the steering committee of the Colorado Outdoor Business Alliance, and one of the things that we've noticed is just really framing the discussion in a way that's going to resonate with the person you're having that discussion with, can be really effective. And so we're all about environmental causes and land stewardship and land conservation and things of that nature. And when framing arguments or discussions, I guess, around those issues, depending upon the audience, we tend to recommend that people come at that discussion from a variety of different ways. And when you're speaking perhaps with more green or progressive candidates, you can really come at it from that environmental stewardship kind of language and perspective. But when you're speaking with someone who's more fiscally conservative and business oriented, just adjusting the way to have that conversation so that it comes from that perspective of small business growth or just economic stability, can be just it's just really interesting how you have to change that argument when you're making it based upon who you're speaking with. And so I can see how coming at it from different perspectives when you're trying to get people on board with funding, could be a really interesting challenge for you guys.
Yeah. And honestly, that was my favorite thing about talking about the census. Was it was literally like, take any topic and I will relate it back to the census. So I had a couple presentations, and, we live in Colorado. We have a lot of people that just choose to live off the grid, mm-hmm. and do not want anything to do with local, state, or especially federal government. So, I had a lot of those conversations, and there was some pushback of just like, this doesn't impact me. Like, I don't care. I'll just skip this one. I'll sit it out. And, they had obviously come to whatever community event or senior event. I did a lot of senior events. And so I would say, oh, well, how did you get here today?
Right.
What road did you drive in on? Because I guarantee you that, looking at our transportation budget in the state of Colorado, like, most of our projects are now reliant on the federal government. So the fact that you are able to get groceries in your mountain community is because we have, federal highway dollars in Colorado to pay
right.
for the funding of those roads. So we got a little lucky with the census, but I absolutely agree with your point that it really is how you frame it. And particularly with funders, they have their own priorities. And I think that, that's a great aspect and obviously integral to their organization. But with the census, it was really just, this impacts so much and everything. It was really easy to relate it.
Yeah.
And bringing up the Colorado Outdoor Business Alliance, I think that was one area that we really just could not get our feet under. The census is nonpartisan, and
right.
it's, in the past, in 2010, the National Census Bureau has had pretty good relationships with McDonald's and Walmart and, printing it on receipts and, even just really simple stuff like that. And we just didn't have that this year.
Right.
And that was pretty much, I will personally say, due to the politicalization of it by the Trump administration. And so we had a number of businesses that just were like, it feels too political. And that I hope will change by 2030, because it was just the most silly argument. And I would just be like, but it's in the Constitution. How can it be political? So yeah, no, I think, that is one thing we kind of started to do at the end, was to talk about economic development. And it's not my background. It's not necessarily Rosemary's background. So it did take us kind of a little bit of time to kind of understand that landscape and be like, yeah, this is exactly economic development.
Yeah. Well, I like that you figured that out in terms of being able to start the conversations from that perspective, perhaps in 2027 or whenever you start to ramp back up. Having that as kind of a framing opportunity is, I think is pretty valuable. It's interesting too. You mentioned the nonpartisan component of it and how it did get politicized a bit in this past year or this past cycle. But that must be an interesting path to trot as well, where you have, foundations and organizations who may have some kind of political motivation or desired slant. How are you keeping those people engaged and excited about what you're doing and maintaining that very, middle ground position that you need to maintain?
Yeah, it had I wouldn't say it was overall challenging, but it did have its challenges. I think it helped that the census has happened before, so it wasn't this like completely new process.
Right.
It started with the founding of our country. We really just made sure to highlight communities and highlight the community impact. I think that was always our main focus. But also it allowed us to make sure that the narrative stayed true to what we were doing. So, the Census Bureau has a definition of hard to count, which, they look at you can call it historically undercounted. And a component of that is, it's kind of the communities you might expect, like immigrants, communities of color, but it also is rural. All of rural America is hard to count for various reasons, and renters. And so, you have such a wide swath of people in that definition. And so we were kind of able to utilize the Census Bureau, even though some people at the top were working against that. And we also use the Census Bureau's own research, and we would present that in meetings, especially to kind of funders and to, high level people that were interested. And we were saying, and the Census Bureau's research was, due to rhetoric, a lot of communities do not want to respond to the census. And so, making sure that we had, not only anecdotal information from the state, but national research was pretty key into taking the stress off of the partisan aspect of the census. And we just, we didn't engage everyone. I think that is another component, as some people just didn't view it as super important. I will say at the end, it was really interesting. We did get more people that were probably more involved, more passionate about redistricting. When they kind of heard the census might not be going as well. They, Colorado is right now poised to gain another congressional seat. So you had some people kind of at the end calling that were concerned about that aspect of like, well, we want to make sure we get the congressional seat. And we were like, where were you 3 years ago? But that's to be expected. So yeah, I think it's just, in any kind of coalition work, you have people come in early, you have people come in late, and you just try and stay on message and, having our program be statewide and focusing statewide really allowed us to bring the conversation back to Coloradans, because that's what this work was about, was making sure that our state is counted, because if it's not, we all suffer.
Right. That's really, I mean, it's just fascinating. All the things you had to juggle there to get the job done. What portion of your outreach or of your operating budget was around that outreach piece, in terms of just kind of citizen education?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we put most of, our method was train the trainer. So we would, I don't know if we probably should have had a larger budget. I will say we didn't necessarily do the best job with social media. That was not something we prioritized that we probably should have. But we really focused on being the conduit from the messages we developed ourselves and from national advocacy organizations like NALEO Education Fund, the National Leadership on Civil and Human Rights. They had staff, and they have policy shops, they have communication shops. And so they were kind of presenting us with national messages, and then we would kind of filter it through and take it and interpret it through the Colorado lens, and then pass it on to these organizations. Because as a new organization, we had no kind of community clout anywhere, right?
Right.
But I will say, in terms of, we did spend a significant amount of our budget, I would say probably about 30%, to make sure that these nonprofits were up to date with their communication. So that's okay. It kind of ties back to that training. So we developed a census guidebook. It was about 10 pages, and it was kind of a glossy color. Colorado tried to make it Colorado specific, but after the training, they could take this and they could either use it with their promotoras, or they could use it with their other staff, and have a resource right there, where they didn't have to call us every time they had a question. So we had that in English and Spanish. Okay. We had kind of just luckily basic outreach cards that didn't have a lot of dates on them, so we could use them throughout the duration as the dates were changing. And the other component is that we wanted to make sure that the information was as open source as possible. So I think particularly with the coalition aspect, we did pay a cartographer to create a kind of digital map of all of the grantees. So instead of the grantees having to go through us if they wanted to contact someone, in their region or in their area, they could just use this resource, go online and see who else got funded, and where they were working. Because that was the other thing that was really interesting to us, is a lot of these nonprofits are, they're expanding into different areas, either permanently or temporarily. And so their offices might be in Denver, but they work in Park County, or they work, and they might have one staff member in the San Luis Valley, but their main office is in Denver. So we created an open source map just to, with contact information and kind of a little bit of details, to be able to see, we don't want to be gatekeepers of this information. This is a coalition. This is really important work, and we want to make sure that everyone knows as much information as possible. And that is why we provided our trainings for free. We gave out our materials for free. We really tried to be just a useful resource for these organizations. And so, I guess that would be in the wider comms budget. But it was a significant aspect of our budget.
Yeah, that's cool. One of the things I heard you mention was that you didn't have a great or a robust social media presence. But did all of these groups and organizations that came into that coalition, I'm assuming that they had mobilized quite a few volunteers, or potentially had a wider reach opportunity that you could tap into?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with COVID, most organizations pivoted to some type of online engagement, which became really important. So, we were able to make sure that those organizations had the right messaging and the correct information um, available for their sites. We did do some Facebook ads, which was more challenging for census than typically, because Facebook determined that census was a cause. So you had to, you had to go through a little bit more hoops to make sure that you were able to verify your identity. But the benefit was that we had very little disinformation on Facebook, which was really helpful.
Yeah.
Obviously, as we've seen the opposite effect of that. So I think we did do some of that, but social media, it's definitely not my expertise at all. And so I can't really speak to it, but we did do pretty well with our engagement online. But I think it's really hard to remember back, but I think in 2020 we really went through some roller coasters of like really engaging online and then really disengaging online, and kind of the yin and yang of it. So it was really hard to put a finger down on it. We did have some mini grantees, and they did phone banking. So especially if their project was completely in person and they really had to pivot, they did have a number of volunteers kind of on deck. And so they're like, how can we do this phone banking? And we helped develop a script, things like that. So there was a lot of pivoting, and there was a lot of movement at the end as well. So it wasn't easy, but I think, I was really impressed with how the organizations were able to handle it.
Well, it sounds like you made the best of what you could do, kind of like everyone was trying to do last year. It's like, well, okay, what do we do now?
Exactly.
Let's give this a whirl. I love the idea that you've mentioned a couple times in terms of teaching the teachers, and just empowering people to have the tools and the know-how and the authority to be able to distribute that story. And that kind of falls in where one of the phases of our kind of engagement life cycle that we think about, it falls into this inspire phase, where really trying to get all of your constituents or all of your stakeholders to just further the cause in any way that they are able. And whether that's making a donation or volunteering themselves, or just sharing the word and spreading that message as far as you can, tapping into that wider network and giving them the tools to stay on message, I think would be something to really keep in your back pocket for when we roll into the 2030 census time. And who knows what'll be going on then, but at least that becomes kind of an arrow in your quiver that you can deploy to to help spread that message and make sure that it's accurate.
Yeah, and it was great for us. So we had a half day of training that we did make mandatory for the grantees, but we opened it up to anyone that wanted to join. And I think, particularly when you have something like the census that seems so kind of boring to a lot of people,
right.
When you kind of talk through it and get into the weeds of it, you're talking about how you identify racially, and, particularly the fear around the administration trying to add a citizenship question.
Right.
And so you're getting into these like pretty weedy aspects of how do we talk through this and how do I self-identify? I don't see myself on this form, or like this is, especially if you're from Middle East or North Africa,
Right.
technically the advice is to designate yourself as white. And so it was those tough conversations of, but I don't receive any benefit from labeling myself as white because I don't look white to
Right.
other white people. It was those conversations that made the census more personal, and it helped. I don't think it fully did, but I think it helped them get over their reservations, and helped us understand what those reservations were.
Right.
I can be very systems oriented and kind of forget about the people, and and then we would be in these trainings and they're just like, you're telling me the government is actually going to keep this information safe? Like, when have they ever done that? And you're like,
Right.
okay, let's talk through that. Like, let's talk about how the Census Bureau is surprisingly different, and I don't know why it is, or I can tell you why it is. And I think, one of the biggest challenges in the beginning was talking with the Asian American population, because in 2012, the Census Bureau kind of admitted to the fact that they use census numbers for, Japanese internment.
Uh-huh.
And so dealing with that cultural legacy in an age where, no, a lot of people don't trust the government more.
Right.
There were some real kind of recent cultural traumas and very valid concerns that we really needed to talk through. And so that training helped us bridge some trust with the people that were actually going to be talking to individuals, and make it, and having those conversations makes kind of the engagement not as robotic, or not as, I think, fake is what a lot of people would kind of describe it as, is, inauthentic.
Yeah, I was about to say it sounds more authentic, which in theory brings even more trust to the table. And it's interesting that you mentioned authenticity, because that's one of the things that I think harms both, for-profit and nonprofit organizations out there is correspondence and automation, which all seem good, and we've moved pretty far in that direction in a lot of respects. But we've gotten away from that authenticity, where emails and messaging and advertising all feel like they're coming from machines as opposed to coming from a person to a person. And so there's seems to be a pretty decent movement or a desire to kind of step back from that and come back to the idea that we can create interactions and engagements that are helping to build relationships, and that are more authentic, and just taking the time to craft messaging, even if it is going out in bulk, craft messaging that does feel like it comes from a place of authenticity. And so it's interesting that you've seen that in your work as well.
Yeah. And I'm relatively new to this space, but I had the pleasure of working with, someone like Rosemary, who has been doing a version of outreach almost her entire career,
Right.
whether it was from a official place or an unofficial place. And, a lot of things have changed about it, but a lot of core elements have not, which is, talking to people or interacting with people one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
And, people don't want to be lied to. They don't want to be misled. And so, there's a lot of just like kind of basic outreach and kind of elements that I think we can tend to forget when we have like kind of new flashy technologies, which are really
absolutely
great and totally benefit. But I think, we really have to kind of go back to the basics. And that was one of the things we would talk to a lot of organizations about, of like, who's your intake specialist? Like, should we, could we train them? They're the ones, at your front office. Or could you a lot of organizations did hire a temporary census outreach coordinator, because it's a full-time job and it takes a lot of work, and it really takes that, human interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really does. And that's a piece that it is really just interesting to see how things are shifting back to this idea of authenticity and this idea of coming at it from a one-to-one instead of always thinking about how can I streamline this to get the message to the most people possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have plans in the next, during this kind of downtime, to be somewhat active in terms of just education in building trust in the census at all, or is it something that just ramps up starting about 3 or 4 years out?
I think from my position, it would probably be ramping up. I do love the census. I would always talk about it to anyone, but the Census Bureau, they had positions called partnership specialists, and there has been, and they were the ones, really, they were kind of community organizers. They weren't called that, but that is what they were doing. Unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of resources to provide to organizations or local governments, but they were kind of the organizing body on the ground. And we had great staff in Colorado, and we worked really well with them, even if we did have critiques of the Census Bureau itself. And so there has been national calls to the Census Bureau to keep at least a number of those people on staff throughout the process, to not only to kind of keep a little bit of the coalition alive, but also to do some education. And I know that they have done that in the past, but I'm not quite sure what that will look like right now, because I know a lot of the partnership specialists, their contracted end in October. So I think there has been discussions, and I think that we're poised to at least retain more of that information from 2020 than we were in past census cycles. But it's just, there's really not a ton of avenues right now. Mm-hmm. And I think particularly with COVID, we have some like really serious elements of daily life that we really need to focus on. So there just hasn't quite been an appetite. But hopefully, at least the Federal Census Bureau can maybe keep that charge up.
Nice. Well, it's just so interesting. It's such an interesting topic, and it comes around every 10 years, and we don't necessarily think about it a whole lot in between those times. And that's what I'm sort of getting at, is if there was a way to keep it at, obviously not top of mind, but at least kind of back there, like, oh yeah, that's this thing that we get to do every so often. And just, continuing to get people to understand why it's in their best interest to engage with and be part of that process and making sure that everyone gets counted.
Yeah. And I think, this has been a conversation that's been happening with other advocacy organizations that I talk to nationwide, is, maybe not necessarily keeping the census drumbeat alive, but, pivoting to different, kind of keeping the coalition alive. And I think, as we've seen with, COVID-19, there are instances where we need really quick kind of coalition building very rapidly.
Right.
So a number of organizations are working on redistricting, which is kind of the most common sort of next kind of civic advocacy step for a lot of organizations.
Mm-hmm.
We have two organizations, Common Cause and the Rural Community Resource Center. I think that's I'm blanking on the name. They're sort of leading the charge on kind of the redistricting engagement outreach. But a number of, nationwide organizations are pivoting to that. We are not. But I do think that there is a lot of ways that this type of network can continue on, either through, public health means or civic or anything like that. So there are still kind of talks about that. But yeah, I think it's, the nonprofit cycle is just, the longevity can just feel very challenging and
Yeah,
be very difficult.
especially on that 10-year cycle. I mean, maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
the play, is to continue to come up with ways that these organizations and these groups that have come together to form this coalition can stay active in that down cycle between the years when they're really super engaged and super busy. And I think that distribution of public health information is certainly an opportunity there. There may be some other things, to keep all those people, engaged during the downtime.
Right. Yeah, we'll see.
Well, this has been really super fun. I'm excited to know a bit more about how this part of our process works, and to hear all the great things that you guys have done to help fuel it. How can people find out more about either the census or about your organization? Together We Count.
Yeah, I think the easiest way would be to go to togetherwecount.org. And there you can see we did a story map of kind of, the timeline, and there's a lot of visuals and maps of like how the census went in 2020.
Okay.
And then also there is kind of we wrote a kind of policy guidebook, for lack of a better term, for the 2030 census. So that is just sort of utilizing our best practices that we did in the 2020 census, and getting either local governments, nonprofits to start thinking about 2030. And we provide kind of sample timelines, things we don't anticipate changing on the federal level, things that worked and things that really didn't work. So all of those can be found on our website, and then you can contact me through that website as well. So we will have those up. We were going to keep everything up through the redistricting cycle, but since we're not entirely sure when that will happen, we will continue to make sure that website stays up probably through the end of the year.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
I would encourage everyone to go check that out. I'd like to end all of my shows with an ask or an opportunity for you to give people something to do. I like the idea of having conversations that lead to action. So if you were to ask people to take an action after listening to the show today, what would that action be?
Oof. I feel it's funny. I feel like I've been asking people for so much for so long. So there's the part of me that's like, oh, I've tapped myself out of that. I would just ask people to, really pay attention to redistricting. It can feel very partisan, but there is a lot that can be done just as a community member. They take testimony on how the lines are drawn. There's a large process that might shift a little bit based on when the numbers come out, but I would just, pay attention to that, kind of skip over the partisan elements of it. And the other aspect is, in between in between the decennial censuses, the Census Bureau releases the American Community Survey. And that is really the only way that we can kind of judge how accurate the 2020 census was, and also provides us more in time information. So, it goes out to a very small percentage of the population, but if you do receive that, please fill it out. It does take a long time, but it is really important to us. So I would say those two things.
When does that usually come out?
It comes out every year. It only goes out to about, I think it's 5% of the US population, but for some reason in 2020, we just kept getting so many calls. I feel like they were targeting Colorado. So it does go out. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour to fill out, but it's really important information for us.
I actually think I may have gotten one of those earlier last year.
They were sending them out in 2022, which we begged them not to, but
I think I got it in 2019, actually, if I'm
yeah, you might have.
Yeah. So
Also
I filled it out. I remember it taking a while, but yeah, I'm pretty sure I got one of those. That's pretty neat. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Gillian. It was really wonderful to hear what you have been up to this past year. I'm sure that you're ready for a little bit of a break, and I'm excited to keep in touch and hear how things start to ramp back up.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. All right, there you have it. Another great episode of Relish This. Thanks for listening. If you would like to learn more about how to apply the audience engagement cycle to expand your organization's mission, there are two things you can do. Right now, you can go to missionuncomfortablebook.com to download a copy of my book. And while you're there, you can get your purpose-driven marketing score to see where you can unearth some gold for your organization. If you'd like to listen to back episodes of the show or sign up to be a guest, go to relishstudio.com/podcast. That's it for this week. I'll be back next week for another great episode of Relish This.